Romans chapter 2 is, we're actually going to look at the entirety of this chapter this morning. And so I think the best way to do that is to read it. There are times when we read short passages of Scripture for our Sunday gathering, and there are times that we read longer, and this is one of the longer ones. So this is something I encourage you to read along with me. It's so much richness and goodness here. Just by reading it, we'll be blessed, and we're going to talk a little bit about it afterwards. So read along with me, starting in verse 1, Romans chapter 2. Therefore you are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are who judge, for in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things. But we know that the judgment of God is according to truth against those who practice such things. And do you think this, O man, you who judge those practicing such things and doing the same, that you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you despise the riches of his goodness, forbearance, and long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leads you to repentance? But in accordance with your hardness and your impenitent heart, you are treasuring up for yourself wrath in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render each one according to his deeds, eternal life to those who by patient continuing in doing good seek for glory, honor, and immortality, but to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, indignation and wrath, tribulation and anguish on every soul of man who does evil, of the Jew first and also of the Greek. But glory, honor, and peace to everyone who works what is good, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, for there is no partiality with God. For as many as have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts, accusing or else excusing them, in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. Indeed, you are called a Jew and rest on the law, and make your boast in God, and know his will, and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law. You therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourselves? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say, do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through the breaking of the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written. For circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law, but if you are a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if you are uncircumcised, man keeps the righteous requirements of the law. Will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? And will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you, who even with your written code and circumcision are transgressors of the law? For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose practice is not from men, but from God. The entirety of this chapter is dedicated to those within the camp of the Jewish believers, this letter is written towards, trying to help them understand that all the things that they look to in themselves and in their religion will not give them a pass on the judgment of God in their lives. And to understand this fully before we get into the context of what we just read, the context, remember, we can't overemphasize this enough. Paul is writing a letter to these believers in Rome, two separate audiences, some of them being Gentiles, not having the tradition of the Jewish people, and some of them being Jewish or very religious people. And the point he's making, leading up all the way to Romans chapter 3, is both of these audiences will need to understand and accept by faith the gospel. That the only salvation, that anything that we could hope for in our reconciliation between us and God is that he has done the work that we could never do on our own. And the first audience receives Romans chapter 1, 18 through 32 to say, even those who are far off, they're unrighteous, they are not religious, in all of their ways, they are distant from God, they are without excuse. The judgment of God is for them as well, because God has written something in their heart, drawing them into a relationship with him, and they've suppressed that. And they've turned their back on this God that wants to be known by them, and they've pursued unrighteousness. And now he shifts or pivots the argument of the judgment of God being applicable to all men to the religious, to those that are within the Jewish camp of this church. And it's very important for us to understand that, because what he is saying to the non-religious, those who are far off, they don't know God, but they're without excuse, because God has given them an invitation that they've rejected. There's a temptation now for religious people to say, of course God's wrath is for them. Of course God is going to judge them and their unrighteousness appropriately. And what Paul is going to do, and what Romans chapter does, is to take every excuse out of the hearts and the minds of those who might find their pass or their favor with God in anything other than the gospel. Anything other than God doing the good work and God giving grace by faith in what we trust him in. Here's the point, verse 32, segueing to Romans chapter 2. Let's read that. After listing an indictment of sins against the unrighteous, he says in verse 32 that knowing the righteous judgment of God, those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of them who practice them. Knowing the righteous judgment of God. God is perfect and holy, and he's righteous, and he is judging. He's going to pour out his wrath or his anger on all unrighteousness. And what Paul says is we understand that about God. There's something inside of us that knows that God is a judge, that knows that there's something about our lives that is on display. We can kind of sense judgment. It's one of those common factors of all religion, that there must be something about our lives that we do to make us good and not bad, to make us approved and not people who will be far off. The terms for those in Romans will be justified or condemned. What is it about our lives that we have justification in? What gives us that justified stance when it comes to God and who we are? And the really important part of this comes in Romans chapter 2, verse 1. He says, you are inexcusable. The things that you might look to as excuses as to why the judgment or the anger of God against sin would not apply to your life will not work. And that is what we will look at this morning. Paul is going to remove all excuses that religious people might have to try to avoid the judgment of God in their own lives. No excuse for you, Jewish people. No excuse for you, religious people or churchgoers. Here is the way that plays out in what we just read. This chapter is actually very easy to outline. If your brain works in kind of a bird's eye view, which I think is important for Romans chapter 2, there's a very easy outline that you can find in the way that Paul removes the excuses from religious people. He does it in three ways. Verses 1 through 16, he's talking about the judgment of others. How we can sometimes look at other people and try to justify ourselves in that. Now, verses 17 through 24, he talks about the way we look at our own lives. And then verses 25 through the end of the chapter, he looks at this religious system, the ways that we can be judged by religion. Here's an easier way to think about or to remember that. The first part of this outline is, are we better than others? The second part is, what do we boast in? And the third part is, where do we belong? Those are three things that in one of those camps, we can sometimes try to stand in those. Who are we better in? Who are we better than? What do we boast in, and where do we belong? Are sometimes the religious gravitation away from the gospel and trying to find justification in other areas of our lives. So that's what we will look at as Paul outlines these things to remove excuse from these religious believers' hearts that would help them avoid the actual judgment, the perfect, holy, righteous justice of God in their lives. We start with, who are we better than? In chapter 2, verse 1, read along with me. Therefore, you are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are who judge. For whenever you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things. In this verse, Paul is saying, here's one of the ways you might find an excuse. Here's one of the things you might do in your own heart, in your own mind, to try to justify yourself is by placing the judgment on other people. It's a common thing that happens within religion and really within life. If we can somehow figure out a way to be better than the next person, maybe that makes us good. In the context of this, Paul has just listed a long list of sins that he is giving to the unrighteous, the far off, the Gentile, the non-Jewish. And he says, isn't it tempting to say, yep, those people are bad, which means I am good. Those people are sinners, which means I am righteous. Now, here's the reasons why Paul is going to say this is not an excuse for your life. Just being better than a sinner doesn't make you righteous. Here's one reason. As you continue in verse 2, it says this, but we know that the judgment of God, when he looks at your life, when he gives a survey of who you really are, it says the judgment of God is according to truth against those who practice such things. God is judging independent of every other person in your life who you really are according to truth, not according to the curve of what is happening in the culture you belong to, not according to the curve of what is happening in the circle of friends or the people that you rub shoulders with. He wants to know what is true about you and what you are doing with your life. And that makes him a righteous judge because it is not just to grade on a curve. We wouldn't allow it in a normal courtroom atmosphere. We wouldn't allow someone to say, I am good because I can point out other people that are bad. Here's how, a simple way I've learned that lesson in my own life. Very simple way. About a year ago, I got pulled over for breaking the speed limit. And as you can imagine, the lights come on. I'm hoping, man, if there's any way I could get out of this. You talk to the police officer. Hopefully I'm sharing something all of you can feel. You've been caught. You're condemned. And you know you're condemned because he gives you that ticket at the end. And it happened to me, and I get this ticket. And in Idaho, and I assume it's in most states, the legal system is fair to the person that stands on trial. You are innocent until proven guilty. So you come to a place, there's a fork in the road. Do I want to admit guilt, or do I want to challenge this because I am innocent until the judge says condemned? And so, of course, being the son of a lawyer, I thought, well, let's challenge this thing. Let's see what happens. And so I go into the court. Instead of paying my fine, I asked to set up a court date so I can see a judge and tell him why I think I should be justified. And she hands me a piece of paper to fill out and understand the system and how that works. On that piece of paper is an effort for the court to save time. They take away some excuses. They say, here are some reasons why you should not fight a ticket. One of the reasons happened to cut me to the heart because it was my defense. One of the reasons said this, it is not a good defense to say I was going with the flow of traffic. Don't waste the judge's time. And isn't it sometimes tempting to you get a ticket and you say, what makes me any different than everyone else that was driving on this road? In fact, there were other people that were going faster than me. I was getting passed. Sure, I broke the speed limit, but other people were breaking it worse. The point of the note here is that when you stand before a judge and you argue your innocence and you say, I'm justified, he's not going to ask you about other drivers. He's not going to tell you that you can have a pass because you weren't breaking the law as bad as other people. And we have to understand that not just in the way that we think about our lives outside of spirituality and religion, but within the heart and the mind of who we really are. Do we sometimes hope that if we can just separate ourselves from people who are really far off and distant, that somehow we'll be in good standing with God? There's the first problem. Remember, he judges independent of what is true about you. Second problem here. He then goes on to say the truth against those who practice such things. And then verse 3, and do you think this, O man, you who judge those practicing such things and doing the same, that you will escape the judgment of God? The second problem that Paul pulls out that says this is not an excuse is that if you are judging others, distancing yourself from sinners, the only way that could ever possibly work is if you stand totally guilt-free. And Paul says, is that really true of your life? Is it really true that you could stand in God's favor in your own righteousness by judging others and pointing out how much better you are? Is it true that you really are better than them? Are you sure that your case is as strong as you think? Turn to John chapter 8. When it comes to these issues, I think there's no better teacher in this than Jesus. And these are issues that he dealt with all throughout the Gospels. The challenge of religious people being pinned against sinners and trying to stand on who they were within the system, within religion, that they were better than the far off. And this is what happens in a challenge that Jesus has to face with. Chapter 8, verse 2. Early in the morning, he came again into the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and he taught them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees, a term you read that and you just think religious people, brought to him a woman caught in adultery. Now, caught in adultery, sinner to the worst kind, caught in the act. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now, Moses in the law commanded us that she should be stoned. But what do you say?" Then he said this, testing him, they said this, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger as though he did not hear. He writes something. The gospel does not tell us what he wrote. But the result of this is very telling as to what he was doing. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first." Here is the principle. If you stand hoping to be justified in the sight of God by pointing out who is a sinner and who deserves condemnation and trying to separate yourself by being better than them, the standard by which you must apply is you must yourself be without any kind of sin. If that is ever going to work in your life, you have to be able to be perfectly just in the fact that you don't have sin that you're dealing with. And then Jesus goes on to say this. And again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Then those who heard, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest, even to the last. And Jesus was left alone. And the woman standing in the midst, when Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, "Woman, where are your accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." There are so many elements of the gospel that we're trying to understand by reading and studying Romans that you see just in this simple story. One of them being that there is only one perfect judge. There was only one person that stayed behind and actually talked to that woman after it was put forth that the person without sin should cast the first stone. And that perfect judge was Jesus. And the beautiful foreshadowing of the gospel is that the only one that had any right to condemn her sent her free, showed her grace, showed her mercy. Go and sin no more. Everyone else on the standard that if they were going to condemn her, they had to be without sin, had to leave. And so this is what it means for us in our study. If we stand before God and we point out other people's sin, it will only work if we ourselves are guilt-free. And for that point, I hope we are all willing to admit that we would have to slowly put down our stones and walk away. We'll never be people who can be justified and made righteous by pointing out other people's sins. The way I wrote it down in my notes is that distancing ourselves from sinners, distancing ourselves from people who are obviously immoral will never make us righteous. Elevating ourselves above them, pointing out other people's sin, identifying the problems in other people's lives will never allow us to stand before God justified. Why do we do it? Because if we can make other people the standard, we feel like we maybe have a pass, that we maybe in ourselves are good enough. And the challenge of this is I read this and I realize that I'm probably more like a Pharisee than I am the woman who was sent free. The tough question here, when we think about, is this real in our own lives, is have you ever felt somewhat relieved by someone else's sin? Have you ever felt like maybe the pressure is taken off you just a little bit when you see a brother or a sister fall? When you look and you realize that someone that you can so clearly see has messed up their lives, does it ever bring you just a little bit of a breath of fresh air for your own life, realizing, wow, I didn't go that far. I didn't do that. I'm not that bad. If you felt that, and I know if I'm being real in my own life, I have. I've looked around and sometimes put myself jockeying for position in my own spiritual walk, and I've said, man, I've come so far compared to that person. If you can at all hear that, if you can concede some of that in your own life, this is the moment we stop and we say, God, we just want to repent. We want to be refreshed by the reality that will never work. It does us no good to see other people's failures. It should bring us no joy. It should bring us no relief, because we want to stand before you as someone that you are the only judge of. You are the person that justifies us, you and you alone, and I'll never gain any spiritual ground by identifying sin in someone else. Now, second part of this outline. We go back to Romans chapter 2. Now, in verse 17, he's going to start the second way that this is removing excuse from religious people. He starts in verse 17 by saying, "Indeed, you are called a Jew. You rest on the law and you make your boast in God. You know his will and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law, and you are confident that you yourselves are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law." Paul has just read out loud a Jewish believer's resume. They are Jewish. They wear the title. They can boast in what they know about the law. They can boast about the knowledge that they have in God. They are confident that they know how to teach and instruct. They are the ones that God chose. They're the people that God set apart, holy and separated for himself. And God did so many things through that nation, using them to bring the Messiah, the King. And they can think about all these things and say, clearly, look at who I am. I'm chosen. I'm a Jewish person. I have so many things about my life that clearly make me good. This is the question, what do we boast in? Are we people that think about our own goodness as a reason to think we're good, we're fine, we're justified just in ourselves? And this is a problem of religion. So often you can look at the things you've done to clean up your act and to pursue God and to become more spiritual and to obey the law, and it can all turn into this inward focused thing that makes you a better person, a moral person. How many people have been asked the question about where they stand with God or what they believe in, or why they feel like they don't need any extra spirituality? It's because I'm good. I do mostly good in my life. I have a real heart for people. I'm usually kind. I don't lose my temper a lot. I'm a good neighbor. You think about the survey of your life and you just see more good than bad. And isn't that enough? Can I not be justified in all the things that I've done? And now here's the excuse taken away. A couple reasons. One is what Paul says in Romans chapter 2, verse 10, as we go back leading up to this. He says, "But glory, honor, and peace to everyone who works what is good, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, for there is no partiality with God." That's a contrast in the way that God judges, contrasted by the way that we often make a judge of ourselves or others. God has zero partiality. God does not look at someone's name or title or position and say, man, that's someone that I just want to have an extra favor on. And the reason that's a contrast is because we so clearly are partial to ourselves. We understand sin the most in the way that we've been offended. We understand the need that we have mostly in the way that we view the world through our own eyes. We really like ourselves. We like to do well. We like when people appreciate us. We like when we are approved by others. And because we're so partial, it makes us really bad judges of where we stand in the eyes of God. We're not very good at really being honest about our own spiritual state. Not only our spiritual state, but we're not often good at just being honest about the things that we do in life. We oftentimes think we're better at our job than we are. We're better at relationships than we are. We're better at doing random things than we actually are because we're partial to ourselves. Here's one way to think it. I'm going to go back to driving because everything that happens in a car is a learning experience, I think. So this is a survey that was taken by Allstate Insurance, trying to get the heart and the minds and the actions of drivers, surveying where people at as they offer insurance to the average driver. And this is what the survey found. American drivers believe their own driving knowledge, ability, and safe driving habits are substantially superior to those of just about all other American drivers. Nearly 2/3 of American drivers rate themselves as excellent or very good drivers. I'm guilty of that. American drivers' positive self-rating is more than twice as high as the rating they give to their own spouses or close friends. Also very guilty of that, and I think my wife is as well. Drivers also don't think much of the driving ability of people from surrounding states, senior citizens, parents with young children, and especially teenagers. I think we can all agree on that. So pretty much, we all think we're the best drivers on the road, and sometimes comes out as we're driving around, and everyone else is wrong and we're right. Everyone else is clearly rude, and we're the kind drivers. Here's the challenge, because what I just read is how people view themselves. Now I'm going to read the contrasting survey based on the statistics of what they really are up to. It says, but despite American drivers' confidence in their abilities, many admit to practicing dangerous behaviors on the road. 89% admit they've driven faster than the posted speed limit. I dare say it's higher than 89%. 40% say they've driven 20 miles per hour over the limit. Almost half of American drivers say they have driven while excessively tired to the point of almost falling asleep. Excellent drivers, and yet they're falling asleep behind the wheel. 15% say they've driven while intoxicated. More than 1/3 have sent a text message or email while driving. I also think that is low. 53% report having received a speeding ticket or other moving violation. Among these, 44% of drivers admit to receiving more than 3. 56% of Americans have been involved in an accident, and to my point, only 25% say that it was their fault. Of all the accidents they've been in, only a quarter are my fault. So here's the point in seeing this, that sometimes, not all of us, but a majority of us feel like we're a lot better than what the statistics and what the reality actually show. That we think that we do things well, and we can so easily be deceived in the way that we are spiritual people. We think about the things that we do to serve, to teach, to help, to grow, to do things that if you really wanted to make a resume of your life, maybe, just maybe, you could stand on that. Maybe God could look at that and say, you're doing great. Keep up the good work. You don't need any help. You're fine. You don't need me anymore. You're set. Your resume speaks for itself. But what the statistics say about who we really are and what Paul is going to challenge these believers with is, are you sure about that? Are you sure that what you think about how well you're doing is actually a reality? And he goes on to bring up the contrast, just in asking questions. Maybe the questions can draw out some more truth to the answers behind this for the religious elite that boast in themselves, starting in 21. You teach another, do you teach yourself? Are you willing to learn the things that you're passing on to others? Are you willing to take the teaching that you give others, the advice, the wisdom? Don't worry, don't be anxious, trust God, have faith. Do you live it out in your own lives? You who preach that a man shouldn't steal, do you steal? Sometimes we can think theft and stealing is this grievous thing that it only happens in big ways. But do we take what isn't ours? Are we honest about our hours at work? Do we fill out the tax forms correctly? Are we people who can stand on our preaching that stealing is wrong in every area of our lives? You who say, do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, you who say, I'm religious, I boast in what I do you dishonor God by breaking the law? In other words, are you sure that you're perfect in keeping all of the religious things you do to build your resume? Is there anything you might have left off? Does it really speak for who you really are? Because if it doesn't, not only will that excuse be taken away from you in the end, and you will not stand justified, but along the way you're dishonoring God. Along the way you're doing things to bring the spotlight of your life to yourself and making it about all the religious things you do. And when you fall, which you inevitably will, God is dishonored. And that's why he says, because of this, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. As it is written, if you're someone who boasts in your religious portfolio, there will come a time in your life where people who are watching and they're listening to the claims that you've made about God in your life, and when you fall, they will see not your failure, but they will see a failure of God in your life. That's difficult to hear. The call for us to be a light to the world, a city on a hill, doing good works so that God can be glorified. And if we are standing justified because of who we are and what we've done, there will come a day when we are counterproductive in the kingdom. When we do things that will hurt the cause of God's love for this world, salvation for the lost, sanctification for the saved, when we fall and it's about us, our failures will be a system-wide defeat. I was talking to someone when I first became the pastor of this church about one way that this is so clearly seen within the church in a tragic stereotype that happens in the lives of pastors' kids, or PKs as they're sometimes called. The stereotype is that so often or so frequently when someone grows up in a pastor's home, they actually become jaded. They turn their back on the Lord. They want nothing to do with church. And in the dialogue, it was like, why does that happen? And where can we see examples where that didn't happen? And you know what the thing is that really sets apart the fork in the road and where a kid is going to go, that it grows up in such an intense ministry life? Does my dad practice what he preaches? Is he actually doing it? The things that he says from behind the pulpit or on the stage, do I see it lived out in his life? And when the answer is no, you clearly see the result in the way that this stereotype is real. Kids turn their back because it doesn't matter what you say, it matters what you do. And if your whole life is uplifting the things that you say and making that the real you, when in reality, behind the scenes, off the stage at home, it's not real, you're dishonoring God, and the name of God is blasphemed among people who watch. And it's something that we see in pastors' kids that as they make it, as they go from a household that was in ministry that loved the Lord and they become a second generation of that, oftentimes it's because it was real. I can testify to the reality that my dad, my parents who were in ministry, although they failed, they always brought it back to God. It was His grace that got us through. It was prayer that gave us strength. It was the Scripture that guided us and informed us. It was all about God. We weren't justified because he was a pastor. We're justified because God had His hand on our home. And it's a good picture in pastor kids, but it's something we should all be aware of. They just happen to be under the microscope. It's something we should all be aware of as people who claim to be believers, religious people. If our boast is words and action and things about us, and it's not matched, which inevitably will fall, we will be counterproductive. But if we continue to say, none of it matters, the things I do to serve God because He first loved me. He justifies me, not my stuff, not my works. I do my work so that God can be glorified. In the end, we will be people who are humble, who give credit to God. And again, I use the teachings of Jesus to get the real point here. So I'll read another story in the ministry of Jesus, Luke chapter 18. Jesus gives the ultimate lesson here. The point of everything that Paul is trying to say is right here in a story that Jesus tells about two people. One of them a resume person, one of them has nothing to offer. Starting in chapter 18, verse 10, this is a story that Jesus tells. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I'm not like the other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as that tax collector. There's that first part of our outline, positioning himself against a sinner, hopefully to bring himself closer to God. I fast twice a week, verse 12. I give tithes of all that I possess. Here's my resume. Here's what I do. Here's why I am religiously qualified to stand before you and have you give me the gavel of justification. But what does it say? Verse 13. Jesus puts the spotlight not on the person with the portfolio, but with the person who has nothing, and the tax collector standing afar off would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. There is the lesson right there. When we try to exalt ourselves, if we try to stand on what we've done, we are not getting closer to God, we're getting farther away. When you exalt yourself, you're going the wrong direction. But if you humble yourself, if you call upon God not because of what you have done, but because of what he will give you in mercy and grace, that is the way that you're justified. God opposes the proud, but gives grace, mercy, justifies the humble. So, excuse number 2, what do we boast in? When we do what we do, when we think about the measure of our lives, what approves us, what gives us our good standing, is there anything in our lives that maybe we latch onto and say, there it is, that's what makes me good. Here's what I do that makes me someone who will find favor in God's eyes. Humble yourself. Sit down and humble yourself so that he can exalt you by giving you mercy and grace. So, part 1, it's not who we're better than. Part 2, it's not what we boast in. Now we have part 3, going back to Romans chapter 2. We go to the end of the outline, starting in verse 25. For circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law, but if you are a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Remember the title of this third part of the outline is, what do you belong to? And circumcision for this audience in the first century believers, it was the answer of where you belonged. So much of the debate that's happening in the New Testament is all about Jew versus Gentile. And should these Gentile believers belong to the Jewish camp by showing that outward covenant sign of circumcision? Is it something that they need to do? Is this a camp that they need to belong to? Do they need to wear the title? Do they need to look at that to fulfill the law so that they can belong to the nation of Israel through the keeping of that particular thing? That's the debate of the New Testament in the letters that Paul is writing. And the ultimate thing that it is saying is, are you going to belong to us in this way or not? And now Paul answers the final thing, the religion, the camp that you belong to, the system that you belong to. It comes down to circumcision. It's good. Circumcision is good. It is good to keep the law in that way if you keep the whole law. And so now for our modern context, we insert all of the ways that we sometimes feel like we belong to the camp. We replace the name Jew with the title Christian. We replace the circumcision with baptism. We replace all of the temple and everything that it did with church and the way that we gather in our way. And we can put titles on our churches. We can put doctrines to our system to try to qualify it and identify it and say, that's what I belong to. And I want to say 2 things. One is there is profit in that. Profitable if. Circumcision is good if it's part of keeping the whole law. And I think it's true also of the systems that we belong to in our pursuit of God together. This is not the moment of the sermon where I say it is time for us to abandon the church model. We need to do all of the things that are traditional. We need to do away with them. This is clearly saying to us that we can be done with anything that we do that is not simply standing on the justification of God in our lives. There are things that we do that are very profitable. I think it's very good that we gather on our weekends and get together and sing songs together and we worship him as a body of believers. It is profitable that we read his word and that we have someone teach it and we listen as a group to be unified as the body of Christ. It's profitable to serve in the way that we serve, to get together in small studies and pray together. It's profitable to do the things that we do, to allow God to send the gospel through us to the places that we go in mission. All of those things are good if they're taking us to the end goal. In themselves, if they are the ultimate means to an end, if we stop at church, if we stop at sermons, if we stop at songs, if we stop at the way that we serve, and we think, don't worry, I go to that church. I'm justified. I'm part of it. I've been going for a long time. I know the system inside and out. It's to no avail. It doesn't matter. There is no profit in the things that we're doing unless it takes us all the way to the end to stand before the righteous and good and holy God that this is all pointing us to. And so the difficulty of this is maybe the most blended way that we need to receive this is this all can be a waste of time. That's the bad news this morning, is that if you've come here and this is your only pursuit of God, this is your only time in his word, this is the only way that you're seeking him with your life, the bad news is you might belong more to a system than to a relationship with God. And if you stand on the day of judgment that is coming, Romans chapter 2, verse 16, the day that Jesus will judge the secrets of men according to the gospel, if you stand and claim justification because of all the stuff that you did here, participation and service, the attendance and the ways that you have gone out to invite people in, all of that profitable, but waste of time unless it's bringing you closer to Jesus in your life. Unless you leave here ready to do his will, seek him independent of all of these things, having a real relationship with him, it will not justify you. You'll not be justified by church. You'll not be justified by sermons or worship. You have to be justified by God and him alone. We have three things that we look to now. And in all of these, I know that not every one of these is supposed to land in your heart. Some of these are solely, one of these is for you, maybe a couple of them. Maybe you can stand and say, I'm so grateful to get this reminder because I love God, because he first loved me, and that's that. But the challenge here, the application, the way that I'm asking you to allow God to search your heart, have you ever found yourself standing in the way that you've positioned yourself against people, hoping that what you do to be better than the other person is enough? If that's you, come to the Lord, repent, be refreshed, allow him to clean you by his word and be renewed in his presence. Are there times, sometimes, when you look at all that you've done to grow in the Lord? You're doing well. You've got things that are good in your life that are part of the way that God is growing you and building you. But if those things are the reason that you stand before God and say, wow, I'm justified, you need to come to the Lord. Let those things go. Leave those things. They will not justify you in and of themselves. And if this is really just part of a system you belong to, we kind of sometimes go in waves where we get more into the church environment than we do the presence of God. Be refreshed this morning. The Lord's speaking to you and saying, I appreciate all the things that you do. I appreciate all this stuff that you're a part of in the church, but I want you. I want you to be with me. I want to be covering you in righteousness myself. I want to clean you by my word. I want to grow in a relationship with you. And it takes us all the way to the end of this, starting in verse 28. For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly. All of those things that we've mentioned are these exterior things that sometimes we hope will be enough. Nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise, approval, well done, good and faithful servant, whose praise is from God and not from men. That is the ultimate way that you can judge all of this in your life. Who are you living for? Whose praise gives you pleasure? Whose approval is something that will give you satisfaction in your soul? Praise of God and not of men. It reminds me of the final stanza of one of my favorite songs, How Deep the Father's Love Is. I will not boast in anything. No gift, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. Why should I gain from his reward? I can't give an answer. But this I know with all my heart. His wounds, his work, his life, given for mine, has paid my ransom. And with that ransom paid, I stand justified. I stand in the presence of the Lord, ready to be in a relationship with a holy and righteous God because Jesus has taken my place. For all the things that I try to stand on outside of the gospel, they're all gone. I don't boast in any of them, except I know this: Jesus gives me access to the Father. He is the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to him. No one's justified. No one escapes the judgment that is due our unrighteousness except through Jesus Christ.